Welcome to the 6th event in the series Towards Another Architecture. This has been organised by the Farrell Centre, a new public centre for architecture and cities in Newcastle in the UK, in collaboration with the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape at Newcastle University. Now, as this is the 6th event in the series, and I'm sure some of you have been to certainly more than one of the previous ones, you're all familiar with my preamble. So I'll give a sort of condensed version of it as a way of just framing the brief that we've put to our speakers. The starting point is the realization it's now 100 years since the first essays that would later form Le Corbusier's Vers en Architecture were published in L'Esprit Nouveau. And today we are at another pivotal moment for architecture and for the wider world. And the series emerges from the contention that to make sense of this moment, what we need is not a new architecture, as Le Corbusier was popularly mistranslated as advocating, but another one. An architecture is not bound to a single vision, but is diverse, pluralist, and sustains multiple conversations about the active role that architects might play in the world. So the format is a very simple one. It's a 30-minute presentation followed by 30 minutes Q&A. So please do have your questions ready. 2 weeks ago, we heard from the Budapest-based practice Paradigma Ariadne, who explored their work across a range of media that interrogates architecture's past, present, and future. And this evening, I'm really delighted to welcome Kabaga Karanha and Stella Mategi, who are co-founders of Nairobi-based Cave Bureau. And I'll just read out how they describe their work on their website. It addresses and works to decode both anthropological and geological contexts of the post-colonial African city, explored through drawing, storytelling, construction, and the curation of performative events of resistance. The Bureau is driven to develop systems and structures that improve the human condition without negatively impacting the natural environment and social fabric of communities. And by conducting playful and intensive research studies into caves within and around Nairobi, they aim to navigate a return to the limitless curiosity of our ancestors while confronting the challenges of contemporary rural and urban living. Their work has been exhibited internationally, including at last year's Venice Architecture Biennale, where their installation, Obsidian Rain, a transposed section of the Mbai Cave in Kenya, was, by all accounts, for those who attended the Biennale, one of the real highlights. So please welcome Kabaga and Stella. Over to you.
Kabaga, you're muted. We'll start.
Sorry. Yes, can you hear and see my screen?
We can, yes.
Okay, all right. First of all, thank you. Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Farrell Center, Newcastle University. Thank you for inviting us in this engaging subject towards another architecture. For this lecture, Stella and I hope to predominantly focus on our project that consumes much of our research, the Anthropocene Museum. And we are tuning in from Nairobi, Kenya. It's at night here, pretty late. But with that said, we're really excited. And thanks for the opportunity. So I'll just go straight in. So I hope to just read a short extract of one of our essays that we wrote on efflux, which allows us to sort of walk into the cave a bit more clearly and in a visceral way. So in our opinion, architecture really always existed ever since the birth of Earth 4.5 billion years ago, even further to when the vast masses of hot gas and matter rammed through space and time, pulled in by gravitational forces, framing spaces and cavities, caves, indeed, that eventually settled over millennia It was through the movement of rocky masses around the endless number of suns that tectonic shifts within planets of rock melting lava flows afforded the formation of spaces of shelter for living things to thrive. All humans, from our furthest distant hominin relatives, the Sahelanthropus touchedinus, almost 8 million years ago, to our very own 250,000-year-old Homo sapiens species, share this architectural heritage. From civilization's oral and recorded histories of religious revelations to philosophical metaphors and narratives, and as a surface to embed our cultural thoughts and values across cave walls, all having formed an intrinsic part of our past, present, and soon to be future. So these two drawings and works that we presented for a museum critique project, and they are composed of a few factual representations on the northern parts of Kenya to do with our history, an archaeological history, to do with the earliest finds of our species, but more so also intertwining that with the local heritage and spirituality. So as the name states, we are Cave Bureau and we do focus on cave research, but more so looking at caves that have a more recent and more so reference to the 20th century impact to do with how they were inhabited by our ancestors. And we begin to look at these spaces effectively as museums in a natural state, as a way to critique the colonial state that we emerged from and our ability to resist that. And this is one such cave where the freedom fighters, the Mau Mau, would reside, a beautiful, really intimate small cave. At the nave here, the Mau Mau freedom fighters would light their fires. And I think it stretches further back to do with Plato's allegory of the cave, about the philosophical emergence of humankind, should we say, from caves, and our ability to use our thought and thinking to quite precisely emerge from this so-called dark state of our minds, and moving into a sort of state of enlightenment, so to speak. However, that sort of emergence has resulted in a space wherein, with the Anthropocene in context, we have actually, in many parts, caused huge environmental catastrophes into our biosphere. And in turn, we question if our emergence from the caves should in fact be reversed to return back to the cave to contemplate our civilization, or lack of it for that matter.
Now, we do look at different caves around Kenya, and we hope to look at many more and possibly go out into Africa and probably into the rest of the world until we've, had a chance to really study and focus a lot of our research on these caves. And this photo you're looking at is one such time. This was in January of last year. We were in Shimoni Caves. Shimoni Caves were slave caves, or are caves that held slaves in the 17th, 16th century. And we usually go to these caves and we get the local community and talk to them about what the caves mean to them, looking at the past, looking at the current situation they're in, and what they see the future of those caves being. And usually we come out with a wealth of information, and information that's not readily known, it's not published, it's with the communities. And we hope that in time we'll be able to tell these stories so that the world gets to know what happens in some of these caves, some of the atrocities that have happened, some of the environmental issues that they're going through because of the different things that happen in the different caves. Apart from that exploration of caves, it may not look like it, but we're actually a conventional and traditional architectural practice. We go to site, we yell at contractors, we yell at engineers for not issuing drawings, we talk to this council for approval of drawings. So in many respects, yes, we are architects, and yeah, we do architectural work alongside the research that we do. And we're a very small practice. We've got young architects that work with us. They come, go, get more, come, go. But yeah, we really encourage that even as they step out of school and get into the architectural world, that they don't just focus on architecture as it's taught in school. There's so many other aspects, like the research that we do. So yeah, that's us, a bit quirky, but yeah, we have fun while we're doing all this.
So I think, as mentioned, we'll be focusing on the Anthropocene Museum, but within the context of looking at architecture for an age of trauma, resistance, and healing as a key backdrop to our work. So caves as geological structures and spaces are ingrained in our prehistoric consciousness. And for thousands of years, indeed millions of years, they have influenced the way we perceive and define the world around us. Humanity's early experience of inside and out, the nave, light wells, shafts, chambers, and echoes, among many other architectural experiences and features, can be directly connected to our ancestors' encounter with caves and associated networks across the ages.
Sorry, I think that was my slide, got a bit confused, but yeah, one of the things that we do at CAVE is dissect the city. We look at the city and dissect it, and we dissect it and categorize it into 3 areas that we've called the void, the origin, and the made. And a lot of these spaces or categories in the city have come from the colonial era. And if you look at the image on your extreme left, that is an image of what we call the origin. And the origin is the land as it was before colonialism. It's the land that the colonialists came and found. But it is also where the people who are now in their 60s, 70s, 80s, currently in Kenya, this was the kind of life they had because they grew up during the colonial era. And for a lot of them, these were the first professionals, so to say. They were the first people that went to school, the first people that went to university, started work. So they are the first doctors, civil servants, architects, and all that. And what they did is they migrated. At the time, Kenya was getting her independence in 1963. They were in their early 20s, starting their careers. So what they did is they migrated into the city. And when they migrated into the city, already they found the city had been segregated already by the British colonial government. And the void was created. And the void is what you see in the middle photo. And the void currently is a place that's quite problematic. It's very highly populated. It is sometimes referred to as informal settlement. Some areas of the void could be called slums, so we don't like to use that word, but a lot of the working population of the city comes from the void. And a lot of the people from the void are trying to work as hard as they can to get out of the void and go into the made, which is the photo on your extreme right. Now, the made is your more affluent areas of the city. It's the areas that were mostly inhabited by colonial officials, the settlers that came with the colonial government. These are the areas that they took. They were lush with vegetation, cooler in temperature, whereas the void would be more of a savanna landscape. So it's pretty hot. And then as you come to the mid areas, it's a bit more high in altitude. So of course it's a bit cooler. And a lot of, like I said, people in the void are trying to get into the mid. And it's actually a cycle because we have now a lot of rural urban migration. In the rural, we'll call that the origin, that people in the rural areas are migrating into the urban centers. And when they land in an urban center like Nairobi, they will go into the mid because that's the only place they can afford. And they're all trying to work very hard to get into the mid. Of course, now the mid is made up of mostly affluent Kenyans. But with the struggle of, population growth and all that, the people in the mid, ironically, are now going back to the void where it is less populated. But of course, these are issues we then try and address, even in the design work we do in the office. When we get projects, we categorize them and then try and solve whatever issues each of these categories have through design and dialogue with the communities and the people and the developers, the clients that we get. Kabage, you're on mute.
Sorry for that. So taking all that in, we look at the situation we find ourselves in. The proposed Anthropocene epoch, as it has been defined, which has come to being as a result of mankind's impact on the world, to the detriment of many species. And they're complex issues, really, and broad issues, the discourse of which tends to not reside in the global south. And a lot of our research begins to question who should be brought on the table to talk about these complex issues. About one such thing as the International Chronostratigraphic Chart, which identifies our age, where we are right now, being the Holocene, and the momentous transition to move into the Anthropocene, and what that all means as a result of our impact on the planet. And in many respects, this has been critiqued to look at why we're calling it Anthropocene. Shouldn't it be the Capitalocene or the Plantationocene, among others, like the Thulocene as well? But all of this, trying to grapple with it, at least within our context, and consider what it really means for a change in geological time. And as architects dealing with geological structures, as materials emerged from the earth and computed and sort of realized, it is quite pertinent and critical to look at that. And for us, it's really interesting to look at when the proposed time changes. And it is right at the mid-20th century, 1950, with the Great Acceleration. And that moment in time which leaves the Holocene behind and moves into a sort of future of man, or so to speak, as the Anthropocene is defined, or the age of man. And for us, at least, we look at the colonial situation and question, but more so the decolonial movements of resistance that took place right exactly. And that's almost across the global south, where you had these freedom fighting movements, and moments in time which we humans, or at least a number of humans, questioned this age and this epoch. And so we reference a lot of great thinkers in this regard, from Frantz Fanon to Amitav Ghosh, Edward Said. The list goes on and on. More recently, Leslie Loco, to actually critique this time interval, but more so to also look at the modern movement, which, if you look at it in detail, in architecture, it appeared to deny the primacy of language and representation as a core of the architectural paradigm, in preference for the new orthodoxy of the international style. So the modern movement was subsequently developed and projected around the world in the first half of the 20th century, at precisely the moment when the colonial machinery was at its most efficient, decimating the cultural means of resistance. That's one extract from Leslie Loco's book, White Papers, Black Marks. If none of you have read it, I would recommend you do. But I think locally we look at also working with artists. Osborne Macharia produced this work, which are the wives of the Mau Mau freedom fighters. And it's a beautiful piece which imagines the wives of the Mau Mau, because during these moments of resistance, women and children were part of the struggle. And his depiction of the women are quite heroic and beautiful. And many artists as well have grappled with these subjects. But at the heart of it, we look at the museums, which have struggled really as warehouses of stolen loot. One questions, how does the museum confront its dark past? And how do we begin to project our way forward? And I think these are questions we feel here in Kenya, we are in the right place to ask and in the right position to consider what does it all mean. But beyond that, putting architecture squarely as an agent and the center of it, when we look at how the history of architecture has been defined, and in this instant, at least stating within a period, at least within the 1950s, of proposing inserting the caves and one specific cave within this global history repository as a way to begin to open up a much broader dialogue about architecture in its functions, because we used these caves in their architectural capacity to shelter and hide the resistance. And it was very much an architectural act, which we find and begin to map and draw up. So beyond that, within the Anthropocene Museum, there are specific sites we work on and look into. Suswa Mountain, the Shimoni Caves, where Stella highlighted, we do engage with the community to look in a lot of detail. This one site, the Suswa Mountain, quite a beautiful location where we often question what architects tend to look at and imagine a space to insert a piece of architecture. But for us, it's in many respects the contrary. We'd hope this space never has the ravages of architectural hands being laid on it, as difficult as it is, because it is a beautiful site for what it's worth, just as it is. But more disturbingly, I think, if you look much closer to this site in Suswa, geothermal energy extraction is commonplace. Unfortunately, it's extracted to the detriment of the environment and the community at large, even if it is a green energy, which has really allowed Kenya as a country to perform really well, where almost 90% of Kenya's energy on the grid is green. something that's not really spoke about very much, or at least splashed in the media. But with that said, we feel we also have the agency to critique this most complex energy extraction mode, where these chambers and sites are within a game park in Naivasha, close to Suswa Mountain. And unfortunately, it has resulted in a lot of species escaping from the site because of these plumes of steam, as well as the noise and the smells. And so as part of the Anthropocene Museum 1.0, which we exhibited at the Smithsonian Museum in New York, we gathered together a sort of repository of facts about the impact of the geothermal energy extraction, and looking at ways to resist, with the help of the community, ways to resist and highlight the problem. See two species. The first, it's a Farrell eagle, an owl eagle specifically. Yeah. So as I was saying, to do with the two species in the middle. At the bottom is the giant mastiff bat, which is under threat when you look at the context of Suswa and the government's plan to exploit geothermal energy extraction along this corridor. And as well as highlighted this eagle owl, which has actually been identified as a species that has moved away from the Naivasha area where the geothermal activity is taking place. On the right is the baboon, and part of the Suswa caves we analyze. There is a cave called the Baboon Parliament where baboons actually reside and use their, sorry about that. We're having some power issues here, but I'll just continue. I hope you gathered most of what I mentioned. So on this next slide, it is a bronze model. Part of the work we do is scanning the caves and actually working with the community to consider what these caves mean in deep time, as well as recently. And so we, using 3D scanning technology, scan the caves, get 3D molds out of them to broadcast as a representation at scale to do with these caves. So we treat them as artifacts in many ways. Beyond that, we look at the caves' geometries, compare them to ancient pieces of architecture, or more, should I say, classical in reference, like the Rome's Pantheon. With this one cave, the Baboon Parliament, which we found to be of almost similar nature in scale to this architectural piece. But obviously, this Baboon Parliament predating this classical piece of architecture by millennia.
And so one of the things that we look at, for instance, when we went to Shimoni, like I'd mentioned earlier, is the history of those caves and what the community, how the community relates with the past, the present, and what they foresee as the future. So at Shimoni, these are caves that are off the Indian Ocean in the east coast of Kenya. And they were used as holding caves for slaves. So they were captured from the mainland, brought to these caves, chained there as they waited for the ship to travel down the Indian Ocean coast, picking up slaves and taking them down to Zanzibar. Zanzibar was the largest slave market on the East Coast. And from there, the slaves either worked in the spice plantations in Zanzibar, or they were shipped off to the Middle East to work there. And one of the things, of course, we find is that the world mostly knows about the West African transatlantic slave trade, and not so much is known about the Indian Ocean East Coast slave trade. So that's something we hope we can unearth, talk about it some more. While we were there, we found that there were some escape routes that the slaves used, those who were fortunate to escape, and those obviously over time silt has built up and covered them. And we hope to go and talk to government, the locals, communities around, to sort of unearth, go for a geological sort of dig and find more about the history of these caves. So this is a cave, that's Shimoni Caves. And like I said before, we usually go there and engage with the community. So this is one of those sessions where we have sat down with one of the people that run the cave. Apart from the community is the National Museums of Kenya. So these Shimoni slave caves are under the National Museums of Kenya, but also the community has a large stake in them because this is a part of their history. So we sit down with them and we discuss issues that affect them, issues that have come from their past, issues that need to be resolved, but they don't have an avenue to address these issues with, who to address them to. And so in this sort of community talks, then we see how we can link up different stakeholders to answer some of the questions that they ask us or they task us with. Yeah, and hopefully, at the end of all this, we would want that the communities that live around these caves are well protected, that these caves that belong to them are well preserved for years to come, for their generations later on, that the stories that come from the past inform how we go into the future. Yeah, this is an image obviously showing the 3D scan that Kabage was talking about. We take scans of the caves and turn them into drawings. And one of the things we found, the tunnel that we found, actually connects to a set of caves we had never heard of. They're called the 3 Giant Sister Caves. It's a series of 3 large caves next to each other, and the locals call them Giant Sisters. And the tunnel that led from Shimoni caves, the slaves would then find a way through these tunnels and end up in the 3 Giant Sister Caves. And that became a refuge for them. So it will be interesting for us, and of course for the community and Kenya as a large, to just, unearth this tunnel and find what rich history, maybe very painful history, but our history regardless. And it might tell a different story of what might have happened in these caves, or how many people may have escaped, or were they ever found. It's something we're excited about, and it's something we hope to be starting soon, hopefully, rather than later. Just need to reorganize our calendars. Yeah.
So as part of all that research, we also look back at our first iterations, and Obsidian Rain was what we exhibited in Venice. And why we chose this project, because it was the first set of cave that we surveyed, and it represents that first cave that, historically speaking for us, bears a lot of weight and importance. as a cave of resistance and congress, where the African state of the future, at least for Kenya's perspective, was crafted within this cave. And so as Stella highlights, we 3D scanned the cave, we modeled it, and took a cross-section of part of the cave. And now one of our ideas was to transpose that section into Venice as a space of congress and discussion that we would have there. But because of the pandemic, we weren't able. But using the current data that we extracted of the cave, we found it was possible to actually imagine that cave there. And this was one of the first drawings we submitted. And very quickly, the curators thought it would be perfectly suited to fit in the Galileo Cini Dome in Venice, the Giardini. And this obviously being a transposed section of the cave, albeit through number of about 1,000 obsidian stones, lowered at the exact point cloud heights from the scans, that will effectively be a roof over within the dome. And so we used the geometry, the hexagonal geometry of the dome as supports, but without touching the dome itself, because it's a protected building, and unfortunately still crumbling as well. But we wanted to feel and make it part of the structure, which took a lot of engineering with the timber LVLs, which was extracted from a Scandinavian forest. So part of the argument was that to limit its carbon footprint, we wanted a structure that is of a timber that could be reused. And it was only the stones that we would ship from Kenya, and these being obsidian stone as the first tool, if you'd call it, a material that actually transcended us to where we are as a so-called civilization. All really began with obsidian. And it's a material that is not a precious stone. It's not particularly attractive to some people, but to us, it's one of the most beautiful and most precious materials when you look at the historical context of it. And that's why we called it obsidian rain. One of the key things was to highlight the grand fresco of the Cini Dome, but composing our bronze models and leather drawings across the room. And I think beyond that, in our most recent iteration of the Anthropocene Museum is the Maasai Cow Corridor, a project that we were invited to exhibit, or at least talk about, in Dizine's 15th birthday last year, getting the opportunity to talk about a project that is quite dear to our hearts, specifically to do with animal husbandry that is painted on cave walls around the world. As one might be aware, animal husbandry dates back further than the pyramids of Egypt as an ancient practice that is very much common and was common around the world. But in Africa, and specifically Kenya, it is still very much a livelihood. If you'd call it free-range cattle herding, it is what it is. We tend to have the Maasai community, who are a big community in not only in Kenya, but in other East African countries. They still herd their cattle. But unfortunately, due to challenges of space and land that has been either sold by them or taken over by the government, they find it hard to find grazing pastures. And so our proposal was to look at this need that's perceived to be a problem for the city, but that one we can engineer into the grain of the mundane infrastructure as a way to alleviate the ancient practices of the Maasai community.
And so in a bid to find out more about the Maasai and the problems that they're going through currently, we spoke to Emily and Dorcas, who's in white. Emily is in the blue outfit. And these are Maasais who live in a place called Birika. Birika is in the outskirts of Nairobi city. And we drove there and we spoke to them, and we were asking them what the difference is between when they were young girls and they herded cattle for their dads, and now how their children are living as Maasais in an era that, you know, a lot of their land has been sold off to private people who have then fenced off, and, you know, they have signs saying no trespassing private property. And so this has become a big problem for the Maasai people, because this was their grazing land. Even where Nairobi sits on ancestral Maasai grazing land. In fact, the word Nairobi in Maasai language means a place of cool waters. So they would somehow end up in Nairobi, where there was greener pasture, obviously, because there was, you know, it was swampy and there was water there. But for Dorcas and Emily right now, their animals don't have land to graze. And so they find that they walk really long distances. Sometimes they go into the national park, where they get into conflict with the Kenya Wildlife Services, because obviously those are conservation areas. They're areas that have been set aside by government to for the wild animals, but the Maasai need to feed their animals. And so it's become they're actually redefining their way of life, because for the Maasai, cattle is their way of life. Animal husbandry, as Kabage has mentioned, is their way of life. It's been their way of life for millennia. And in their culture, the more animals you have, the more standing you have in society. But because of the reduced grazing lands, they have had to reduce the number of animals they keep, and, you know, and start looking for other ways of life. And in fact, when we spoke to them, they were very clear that they didn't want this kind of life for their children. They want their children to go to school and go into college and get jobs, and not herd animals like they did. When they were growing up, it was, I mean, there was no question about it. You took the animals to graze, but now their children have an option. Actually, it was Emily. I remember we were looking for the animals when we went to visit, and we walked hours and hours looking for them, obviously, because they've gone long distances. And sometimes Emily has to go around, has to herd the animals because there's nobody else to do it. She won't let her children do it like her dad, her father made her do. And so in the cow corridor, we look at radical, we could call them, maybe not radical, let me not call it radical, but remedial acts that we've called reverse futurism. So it's creating a restorative artifacts within the landscape of phantasmagoria in Nairobi. And so what we do is we look at Nairobi as a city. We look at the wetlands within Nairobi, the place where the Maasai actually came to graze their animals. Then we look at the infrastructure that has been put in place. And then we also look at the patches of land that belong to government or belong to government corporations that are not in use. Yet, instead of the Maasai, you know, bustling around the city through traffic with their animals, these are areas that we feel or we propose could be used as places where Maasai from the outskirts would come back to these ancestral lands that has belonged to their people for millennia, come and make use of these derelict railway lands, lands that have been set aside for airports that are not going to be built. But these are lands that are fenced and are lush with grass that could actually benefit the Maasai people. So this was a proposal we had for what we presented to Dizine, and we hopefully would like to see some sort of it put in place.
And I think in the greater detail, as you go and zoom in into the cow corridor, one of our thoughts was that we'd need to address some of key problems about water scarcity. As much as we have rivers, a lot of them are contaminated. And one of the thoughts was to have rain collection follies in the landscape, but specifically looking and using cave geometry, which we reversed and flipped around, to actually, in a mammary way, collect water that would trickle down and create oases for the cows, but spaces as well that could attract animals that are also going through very depressed times to do with climate change, which have resulted in more drought seasons. And so part of the argument is to look to create this artifice, as Stella said, to produce these landscapes and structures of earth and a sort of interesting ratio of concrete that will allow water collection in vast volumes in many respects, but also underground with reservoirs, but spaces of shade, spaces where the cows can lick walls to get their salt quarters, and also cattle dips where the veterinarians can come and treat the free-ranging cows of the Maasai people, but yet certain sections which allowed to get watering holes for both wild animals and cows. And I think beyond that is to think of the vast number of projects of infrastructure that are proposed to look to reverse some of the mistakes of modernism in terms of huge highways in the sky that traverse through cities only to just increase congestion. One of our thoughts was to really focus in on this Maasai cow corridor and allowing for spaces over time to be reclaimed for walking, for grazing, and interaction of both domesticated animals and wild animals to roam, because they do roam within the city. There are many instances of lions breaking into the city, elephants walking through streets. One of the arguments is to why can't we allow this coexisting in a meaningful way? And that was one of the key drivers of the Maasai cow corridor. And to conclude.
And so we conceived what we call the Benevolent Reparations Institute, or BRIT. And this would be an institute through which funds would be channeled. Of course, there's a lot of atrocities that took place in Africa, and I would say the global South. And it's hard to place a person or a community that was not affected. I think we were all affected to some point, and up to today, even as we look at the cow corridor, that's one of the issues that have come up that were brought up by colonialism. Nairobi is bang in the middle of a place that the Maasai for millennia would come and get greener pastures and water for their animals. But when the British government colonized Kenya and they had this idea to bring the railway across from the ocean, Indian Ocean, right through across Kenya, Nairobi was a good place to stop. And when they stopped there, it became a place that was a train depot, and it grew into what we have now, a city with 7 million people as its population. So the way we see it is, it would be very hard, to say, give Stella X amount of money because her great grandmother, this and this and this happened. And there would be so many of those types of issues that would come up. And so what we thought is we could have communities across the 54 African nations would come up with projects such as the Cow Corridor, for instance. And then these projects would be presented to a panel who would then decide from a community, go into a community and ask for ways or ideas or thoughts that they have to solve some of the colonial issues that they are going through right now. And through this sort of competitions that are presented as projects, one project would be chosen maybe from a series of them, and then money would be channeled through that, through the institute to fund these projects that would then go towards resolving. I don't know if resolving is actually the correct word, but towards a better future. When we look into the past, because I say for CAVE, we always look at the past because the past informs the problems we have currently, and then use those things that we dig out from the past on how to go forward in the future. And the Cow Corridor was one of those projects we thought that would be the sort of projects that, these funds would go to help create, I guess, for a better Africa, so to say, or a better healing. It would be a healing for a lot of people. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to us ramble on about our research. We are hoping that you enjoyed and have thoughts on what we have presented.
Thank you very much, both of you, for an extraordinary talk and just sort of mesmerizing body of work. And I think kind of fittingly, we got questions actually during the talk. So one of the people who's asked questions has actually had to leave already. So I will ask her question on her behalf. And that's Jane Gibson, who says, caves are often very private places for the communities that own them. Is there a conflict of interest in bringing these places to wider audiences?
Yes, it's true. Like a lot of the spaces within the caves are very sacred to the communities that live around there. There are places even they hold, worship. They worship in some of these spaces. And of course, you wouldn't want a wider audience into such a space, but we look at it a bit differently. Rather than, bringing attention to, yes, we will be bringing attention to these caves, but also there's issues that these people would like addressed around those caves. For instance, the Suswa caves. have been earmarked by the government for more geothermal exploration. And that means a lot of people will have to be moved from that area as the government moves in to explore and exploit the geothermal. But then we would need to bring this to a wider audience, obviously, to sort of get more voices to lobby for such spaces to be protected for the locals that live around these caves.
Yeah, I wouldn't add too much from what Stella said, but yes, these intimate spaces are, for us, we look at them as spaces we interact with the communities, as opposed to advertise them to the world and say, go there as an, a sort of tourist attraction. But we are also conscious that, yeah, some of the work we're doing is exposing them out there. But I think at the core of our focus is not to pull in as many tourists as possible. It's to allow the communities to dictate what their future is. Yeah.
We had another question that came into the chat from Ruth Morrow, who gave a lecture a few weeks ago in this series, and I think Ruth has asked another question. I think is present in the talk still. So we'll go to her to ask both of those questions. Ruth, are you there?
Yeah. Hi. I was really brilliant, really fascinating, and just amazing to take me out of the space that I'm in and take me to another part of the world. So thank you so much for that. I mean, I'm really fascinated by the cave. That was a really early, I think you even hinted at it, that somehow we could return to the cave. And you also talk about this, what was it, reversal future or...
Reverse futurism.
Reverse futurism, yeah, which feels like as if you're kind of going back to older, more traditional practices, which is fascinating and at the same time challenging to think how that might work. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about that? And then I suppose my follow-up question really is that avoiding the mistakes of the past. I mean, obviously, any mark that we make, nowadays we feel its weight in the world, mainly because there's so many of us, and when we all make marks, that adds up to considerable weight on the world. So how do you then foresee, making some of these infrastructural projects that you're proposing without adding to that weight on the world? Yeah.
Maybe we can jointly answer that question with Stella. Thank you. Quite provoking questions. I think for us, the reverse futurism takes a literal tone. As you highlighted, we talk about returning to the cave as a sort of sum of all parts. If we look at the end game of the Anthropocene, we might push ourselves to that point of destruction. You look no further at the war that's about to kick off between Ukraine and Russia, and the risks there with nuclear warheads, which also are markers in the anthropogenic timescale. And what it's saying is that we have a propensity to really be self-destructive. And if you look at the end game of that, it's literally moving back to the cave. And with that in mind, you almost question our capacity to do good on this planet. But with that said, and looking back at such propositions as a cow corridor, a lot of what we're proposing are extremely limited carbon intensive projects. we are suggesting that land that's not being used can be used for the population. And these structures and follies compose of a very minute component to the whole corridor. But in a way, in terms of, for example, how the project was received, it was extremely provocative, at least for us. It got a bit of airtime in the media. We were called non-architects, insane people, don't listen to their crazy ideas. It might not see the light of day, but I think the nature of questioning imagination within this time of the Anthropocene is so critical. And looking at architecture as not being so passive and subservient to the capitalist and neoliberalist pressures of the world that require really provocations that question the heart of architectural production. And I think part of what we're doing is looking at that space on many multiple layers. And as much as it doesn't end with, okay, final building and okay, here are cross sections, it's a series of provocations which we feel need to be injected in the discourse that will allow for possibly a new mode of thinking and approaching these very complex problems that we're faced with. Yeah. In a roundabout way.
Has he answered your question? I feel like I'm not able to add more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love hearing both of your voices. Actually, I think you both speak quite differently about the work. So, I mean, if you have something to add still, please do. But yeah.
I guess it's just in addition to what Kabage has said, yes, it may not be built as we have proposed, but the whole idea of it, we hope, would be taken up even by government, you know, because currently, and just as an example, just the other day, I don't remember where we were driving with Kabage, and there was a herd of cattle on the road, and you have to sort of wait for them to move so that you continue your journey. But it's actually a real problem. They will come to the city, whether the city officials enforce it or not, because at the end of the day, for the Maasai, their animals must eat, and they will, and they're pastoralists by nature. That's their way of life. They will move their cattle from place to place. And so when we look at these maps of Nairobi and look at the chunks of land that are owned by government that lay bare, nothing is happening. We have old trains, rusting away in these spaces, old planes going to die somewhere. But if we could sit with some stakeholders in government and private sector and think of ways that we could address the issues instead of ignoring them, because I feel like a lot of it is ignored, but it's there, and we bury our heads in the sand. The Maasai will still come with their cattle. You will wait for them in traffic to pass, and and yeah, it's something I think we need to take seriously. And as much as it's a pretty radical suggestion, obviously, like the last image you saw with the elevated savanna on a road that's currently being constructed, obviously, for more traffic, more cars, more pollution. We could, I think, engage with different stakeholders to see how to address this, and in that way also just improve derelict lands, improve the life of Maasais, and hear them out, listen to them, because yeah, like I keep saying, it's there and they will still come. Whether they get arrested or not, they get arrested a lot, but they'll still come. And usually it's funny, they'll be arrested on a Friday because obviously no government offices courts won't be open on Saturday and Sunday. So they spend the weekend in a cell. And on Monday, you'll have to let them go. And they'll continue grazing the animals. Yeah.
It's quite a story. I mean, the juxtaposition of the cow and the car is just in your images is quite some revealing in and of itself. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. We need to draw things to a close very shortly, but I just wanted to ask one question myself before we do. Extraordinarily a thought-provoking body of work, and one of the things that I was interested in, Stella, you concluded the talk talking about how the past informs the problems we have now, but at the same time we can use the past to think about how we go forward in the future. And I was really struck by this notion of reverse futurism. And you just sort of talked just a moment ago about this idea of improving derelict land, improving lives. And I was wondering, given how we talk about the Anthropocene and climate catastrophe, it's it presents a vision of the future, which is not a particularly enticing one, put it that way. But the way you describe your work is propositional, it's optimistic. Is that something that's conscious? I mean, architecture itself is, in very simple terms, is a kind of optimistic practice, because it's about creating something with the expectation it's going to endure, that there is that the energy and money and labor expended in something is going to generate some kind of return, whether that is in a very crude sense financial, but whether it's social, cultural, whether it's in terms of sort of sustaining human interactions in a very basic sense. So do you see what you're doing as optimistic? Are you optimistic about the future in what you do?
Wow. Yes and no. But yes, because these are things obviously nobody is talking too much about right now in Kenya. And like Abage said, we've been called non-architects because of this research that we do, but we feel like there's so much that needs to be told. There's so much that needs to be taught, so much that needs to be given out to the public so that they actually know. Because I feel like a lot of what is happening right now is people are clueless. I don't know why I am working really hard to get out of the void to go into a mid space. They don't realize that is something that's been created by past problems, and they don't see it as that, or like congestion in these informal settlements. They don't think it is something, or they don't know, actually, that's the better word to use. They don't know that it is something that has been created in the past, and that's why they're in this situation. So maybe let me use the word optimistic, that we will be able to get a larger audience, especially within our context in Nairobi and in Kenya, that we will get people thinking that you don't need to get out of the void, actually. You can make the void as good as the maid, and you don't have to struggle to get out. You don't need to have rural urban migration, because we can make government, make people start thinking about developing whatever it is people come to the urban centers for. So to some extent, yes, we're optimistic that, what the research that we're doing is going to inform some decisions sometime in the future. And the reason I would say no, we're not optimistic is because we are just starting. It's also something new for us. It's something we are discovering every single day as we go into the research. And so it's when we sometimes sit with Kabage and think about it, it's so huge, it's almost scary. So that's the bit I would say, no, we're not optimistic because there's so much that needs to be unearthed. It's just, you know, the two of us here at CAVE trying to do it. And we're just hoping that a lot more people will get interested and join us in, in unearthing all this and informing the public so that there's more public participation in everything that is done going forward.
I think I won't add very much of what Stella said, but I think architecture by its very nature is a practice in a sort of finite finite moment of optimism. I'm finding it difficult to encapsulate it, but the tools of our training and our capacities to visualize and consider problems with hindsight of solutions, at least the way we look at it. The nature of that is very, very much optimistic. It is at its heart an optimistic profession. But I think it's when now, which goes back to, I think, what Ruth was highlighting, to do with the challenges of trying to fix one infrastructure with another infrastructure. The optimism gets carried away, or we get carried away with that optimism, which is effectively, in a way, what modernism is. And being able to, or was, should I say, being able to unpack that and be considered in terms of what impact really means. But I think I'm really encouraged with at least our ability to unpack the issues using architectural language and tools, and also present potential ideas of solutions which may remain in a sort of imaginary, but I think have the capacity to eventually develop and shape real-time solutions. So it's a really fascinating question. We've never really been asked that. And I think it's a really important one. Yeah, thank you.